Greetings and salutations, listener. It is I, Eric J. Chucky, joined as always by my fellow Dungeon Mon Master, the boy.
Hi.
I fucked up your intro, huh? This is the Two Nerds Podcast. This week's episode is brought to you by Lord Voldemort, who accompanies us in Funko vinyl pop form. Brandy insisted that we talk about our adorable Lord Voldemort pop because he's adorable, and now we have. It's also brought to you by Maruchan Ramen Noodles, the instant lunch chili lime shrimp variety. I haven't had this in years because I've been watching my salt, but it's been upgraded to a sometimes food instead of a never food.
Awesome.
And it's delicious.
We don't actually have a deal with Maruchan Instant Lunch Ramen. He's just eating it on the podcast,
Well, nor do we have a deal with the Dark Lord Voldemort.
No, sure, we don't. We totally don't.
And of course, our theme song was brought to you by Super Blizzard Shining Wasato. Name of the track is Let's Get Hardcore. You can pick that up on his Bandcamp page. You can also go by Joylancer if you're cool. I think that's it.
That's what cool people do.
Yeah, I bought it. I'm cool.
That's still what cool people do, even if you bought it.
This week, we are still not talking about Ant-Man.
Look, real talk, life happened. We probably missed it in theaters.
That's alright. I'm sure it'll be still just as funny on the small screen.
Yep, it's not a big bombastic movie from what I
Well,
understand.
and we saw Winter Soldier and Thor, the first one, on the small screen, and they were fine.
No, we saw...
or not Winter Soldier, I'm sorry.
We saw
the
First Avenger. Yeah, we saw Winter Soldier in the theaters because we're good people like that.
And also the small screen because we liked the movie.
And I will watch it again soon because I do like that movie quite a bit.
Boy and I were having a conversation the other day, a couple of weeks ago, before all the video game music happened, and we were talking about campaign settings for role-playing games. Pen and paper role-playing games, well, really any kind of game, honestly, has a campaign setting, but more often than not, since we're not programmers, we use them in pen and paper role-playing games.
That's true.
So we thought it might be interesting and perhaps even helpful for you out there as dungeon masters to talk about how we develop role-playing game settings and, maybe share our little tips and tricks.
Yeah, ultimately, it's a fairly similar process for both of us. We just sort of go at it in opposite directions, so...
Why don't you lead us off there, Robot?
Okay. Well, how I build a campaign setting, how I build a world, kind of depends on what I'm doing. Usually I will endeavor to make the world as full and fleshed out as I possibly can, so that then when the players show up, I can just drop them on a point on the map and watch them go.
That's something that I got to do with my Cole Regan novels, was by the time I started writing the second one, because I dragged my feet so much on the first one, I had a lot of time to set up, a lot of the world. So I had the advantage of being like, here's a cool thing that I think the readers would think is a cool thing to see and unravel the mysteries about. Mm-hmm. And it does work that same way in a role-playing game. Yeah,
pretty much. For worlds, depending on whether it's, what setting it is, I use different sort of logical chains for modern settings that aren't fantasy necessarily. And for sci-fi settings, I try and use scientific logic. Not real scientific logic, let's be clear, I'm not a scientist or a doctor of sciences. So it's just simple, reason logic. If this thing exists, why does it exist? How does it exist? That sort of thing. That helps me inform the world. Usually what I'll do is, I'll pick a thing to create first, like races, and then extrapolate, well, these are the races I want. What makes these races happen in a sci-fi setting?
Sure.
Or I'll pick, the worlds, what they're like, and then extrapolate what kind of peoples come from something like that. It's all about picking your starting position. With sci-fi, I usually prefer to pick races, to start with races themselves, because there's usually so many more options for aliens in a sci-fi setting. And so it's good to get a whole bunch of options right up front and then extrapolate out, and it allows you to build a lot of different varied worlds as a result. For fantasy, I actually do it a little differently. For fantasy, I try and figure out the origins of the world, and then go forward from there to determine where we are and why we're there.
Origins of the world. Could you elaborate on that a little bit by what you mean exactly? Like the world that was created in 7 days kind of thing, or?
Sort of, yeah. This is actually something we've only really talked in depth about creating sci-fi settings, because we've bounced ideas around for sci-fi settings. You've seen me create a fantasy setting. I dictated one to you.
Yeah, I took notes, and at one point while you were being really boring, I drew Kirby dancing. So, because that's the kind of friend I am. Oh wow, that was a bitter face. I'm sorry, brah. I thought you liked Kirby.
Anyway, with fantasy settings, usually they have a creation. By the way, I love that you're having me talk first so you can eat your ramens.
Oh, I can talk more. What's up?
But no, I just wanted to make fun of you for it. Usually fantasy settings have a beginning. They have an origin story. You know, in the depths of time, this thing happened, the gods created the world, or the world was hewn from pure chaos by the Titans, or whatever. That is a great starting point for how you build a world. Now, I can't really discuss, because most of my active fantasy settings, you're currently playing it.
Sure.
So I can't really talk about the specifics without giving away spoilers.
Well, let's kind of switch the track a little bit there, because that's something I find interesting. Often when I'm creating a fantasy setting, I will, I kind of start from the races, because when I'm making a setting, I need to know what I'm doing mechanically in order to support the players I have. Because while what I care about first might be a bunch of other shit, because I'm building a place for them to live, what the players care about first is, who can I be? What can I do? Why do I do it?
Yeah.
So, while I don't necessarily start with races and I'm like, all right, I need to figure out every race I need to do. Fantasy setting, especially, I sit down and, okay, am I doing dwarves? Am I doing elves? Are they going to be different? Are they going to be traditional? And whenever I get my races or even my sub races down, I will usually start really building the world with deific pantheons, which isn't quite the same thing as a creation legend, but I mean, you're in the same ballpark. To wit, I don't think I've ever established a creation legend for any of my fantasy settings.
It's really a great way to help firm up the logic of the world.
Sure. I think it's because there are so many different religions within my settings, and while, as in most higher fantasy, the gods have, a direct impact on everyday life, so other races will acknowledge other gods as a thing that exists. They aren't necessarily all worshipped.
In the grand scheme of creation legends, only one of them is right, sort of thing.
Right, and to establish that kind of,
makes a winner pantheon.
Yeah, it shows your hand too, and it.
Well, that's the thing.
You like to make the winner pantheon?
Well, no, it's I don't tell my players which one it is.
Sure. Well, precisely.
Usually, and because the world is created, the world is there, and in fantasy settings with, gods that exist in everyday life, presumably there was some intent behind the creation of the world. With that in mind, there is a winner pantheon, even if you don't actively decide which one it is.
I mean, that's sound logic. I'm surprised I've never taken that to its ultimate end. Yeah. I think it's just my nature. I just inhaled a bit of ramen dust. Hold on. Delicious homemade tea. Also not a sponsor. I think it's more my nature as somebody who likes to leave a little mystery at the end. Questions that are never answered. To just not decide who the winning pantheon is.
I know that makes sense. That being part of your thing.
Well, we're sharing this with the listener.
It's more that you like. Excuse me, that was me swallowing bitter. I really hate that.
Really?
Yeah, because when we're talking about, like, for instance, the Colt Regan lore that the listener does not get to know, because it's
someday.
It's going to be in future books, from what I understand. When we're talking about that, you eventually get to the place where you just start being an enigmatic fuck for no reason, and it's frustrating because I create settings from that other direction. It feels purposefully feels like purposeful no, that word's not obfuscation. There, it wouldn't come out of my face hole.
That's really interesting. I'm kind of glad that the conversation took this route. I think it's because, well, for two reasons. And specific to the cult setting is reason one. So,
well, yeah.
We could talk about that privately, but I use this sort of thing in a lot of places. Right. So I can... Reason one is always going to be specific to whatever setting. I don't want to tell, the creators, the sub-creators, X, because they don't need to know it.
Right.
Because it is going to taint their pudding. That's I just made that up, but please, for the love of everything, listener, tell me you understood what I meant by that.
They can't talk back.
They can't. There is an idiom that should go there. It's going to,
it taints the results.
Yeah, it's
I don't know why you picked pudding is the reason.
I'm really hungry, man.
Yeah, clearly, you brought snacks.
I did, I brought snacks. Sometimes I get to be the unprofessional bent, sometimes you get to be the unprofessional bent, and it rotates. So that is reason A. Reason B is... Actually, I reversed that. Reason number 2 is that I don't want the creators to... The DMs, as it were, the people who are into the thing, even the players to that extent. Because, it kills all the mystery. It blows that hole in the setting that, okay, in the real world, despite, the varying evidence, we have no final confirmation as to who Jack the Ripper is.
Okay.
That's a mystery that exists. Or better yet, the Zodiac Killer, because there's even less information there.
Okay.
So there are lots of people who pore over the cryptograms and the ciphers and, try to make connections and figure out who the Zodiac Killer was. And, people can refer to it, in conversation and be like, oh, he's quite the mystery person like that Zodiac Killer. People know what you're talking about because it's a big thing. If the player characters, as it were, out of game, know who the Zodiac Killer is, it drops that curtain and there is the wizard.
See, but that's not... I don't really feel like that's necessarily going to happen with that bit of information. I don't tell the players because this stuff, because normally it logically extrapolates spoilers, and I play with you.
Sure, and you can't do that.
Yeah.
Because if you give me a thread, I will hand you a sweater.
Yeah. So but that's the reason I go.
Sure.
But for instance, like D&D.
Okay.
For instance, the Planescape setting. No, I don't think it's the right one. Faerun.
Okay, yeah, Forgotten Realms?
Yeah, Forgotten Realms.
Okay.
The creation of that is known. The story of creation for that setting is known. It is a fact for public availability. AO, that's how I pronounce it. I've never actually heard it said. Created the world. He mostly doesn't give a fuck about it anymore. And the various pantheons of gods, I believe this is the Forgotten Realms stuff. It might be for a different setting. It's been years since I looked it up.
Sure.
But
It sounds, I don't know, whatever.
But they gather worshippers because worshippers give them direct power. This is something that's known.
Okay.
Like God needs worshippers badly, sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's known outside the setting. It doesn't impact the player characters at all.
Well, but by the same token, those.
As a different example, and this one is one for a campaign we played that I can tell you because you already have this spoiler.
Okay, go ahead.
In the fantasy campaign with Maul, which I believe we've mentioned on the podcast before.
Yeah, tons.
Yeah. The world looks the way it does and is the way it is because, and I know I've mentioned this before, it has the exact same dimensions as Earth. Like, the continents are all the same shape. What's on them is different. The reason what's on them is different is because it is Earth. And it's just in the sort of dawn of time, something happened, and the specifics aren't really important, and also that's a spoiler I can't give you, that caused magic to show up, and everything went from there.
So they're like the alternate to our 616.
Pretty much. They're like World 343 or whatever.
Well, I guess, like if it's something like that, I have no problem, giving it away. But especially when I've got varying pantheons, and maybe that's why you and I are coming from a different place on this. Because, as I was about to say, in the setting that may or may not be Faerun that we just discussed, where the creation myth is known and gods exist because they're vying for power.
Mm-hmm.
And even if the player characters knew that, what the fuck would they care? They'd be like, yeah, my god's the best god.
So he gets all the power.
Yeah, good. Sounds good.
Exactly.
But it also doesn't, it's not like Earth, like our Earth, where, every religion has its own creation myth. Or legend, excuse me.
Actually, I think they do. I like, in the universe, every religion has its own creation myth. It's just that outside the players know that those are bullshit.
See, and that's, I don't know, like that kills a little bit of it for me. It would make it hard for me to play a character of great faith unless I was faithful to the guy who was right.
Why? I wonder.
Just like in the same neighborhood as it is hard for me to appreciate a Mission Impossible film because I know who Tom Cruise is.
Fair enough, but like,
I mean, it's not the exact same thing, but it is in the same sort of. No, you have broken my suspension of disbelief too hard, Mr. Cruise.
I mean, I suppose it's fair enough. It's just I don't think I'd have a problem because the character has no way of knowing that, and I mean, characters are wrong about stuff sometimes.
Sure. And I don't know, maybe it's like a metagaming failing of mine. Maybe it's something I'm not good at, keeping the shroud up myself for. But that, like, there would have to be a shred of nihilism in there somewhere where the character's, somewhere deep down, he's like, my god is a lie and nothing is real. Yeah,
that sounds like a metagaming failing on your part.
I mean, we all have our shortcomings,
yep.
That might just be one of them for me. But I digress.
You know what's actually interesting? I was thinking on it.
Sure.
And you're not playing any characters who are deeply religious in any of my current settings. One thing is, I don't actually have a wealth of, overt, very active pantheons in any of my fantasy settings.
I've noticed that, and I think it's kind of weird, too, because also one of the, maybe not the first thing, but the third, I would say, the third thing I digest when I dive into a new fantasy setting is the gods. And, I ask you about them, but once I've established who they are enough to make reference to them, I go on my merry way.
Mm-hmm. They just, to date, none of the fantasy settings I've made have had them be a very important part of the world. And that's not really it's not an agenda. I just realized that. Because I go through the creation process, and usually they aren't involved. They tend to spring up later.
Sure.
And actually, like, I don't even think any of them have creation myths in at least one of my settings. The one with Maul, the religious stuff is very, very thin on the ground, and if you notice, very couched in metaphor.
Yeah.
The other one, the one that I made with you, essentially, that I told you about, there are gods who are active, but they don't have any creation myths. Like, if their priests asked how the world was made, they just sort of smile and nod and go on about their day. They are purposefully enigmatic fucks who aren't telling you. Because they're not allowed.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. What an interesting avenue this is all taken. Listener,
this might be very boring for you.
Yeah, it might be, but I mean, this is really the exact kind of conversation that inspired us to start the podcast. You and I would sit down and bullshit about something, anything as inane as why one edition is better than the other, to recently and most legendarily Superman's Rogues Gallery.
Oh.
Someday, listener. But this is just very, very interesting ideas behind that, and differences in how we are building just the religious aspect of fantasy settings. Because you mentioned as well that when you think about sci-fi settings, you don't think so much about gods. And I think that is because, as was kind of implied, deities don't really take as much of an active hand in your modern and your science fiction setting. Not just yours, but those in general.
Mm-hmm. It's not the tropes you want to play on in that particular genre.
Right. I mean, like, the closest you're going to get is the Force.
Which is a pretty deity thing.
Sure. And Warhammer 40k.
Yeah, well, let's be fair. The gods are involved, but I don't know that they're, anything but an adversary, really.
Right. But, yeah, that's just differences. I love of nuance, and I love differences in intention.
But a great example of the sci-fi races thing, and this is when we were talking about various races that could be in one of your sci-fi settings. I don't even know if you still have these guys in any of the settings. Remember the dudes who were always on fire?
Yeah.
We determined that we wanted a bunch of guys, a race of people who were always on fire.
And also skeletons.
Yeah, always flaming skeletons.
Yeah.
Flaming skeletons.
Here's some insight into, like, the creative process. You know, we talked about, and fantasy for that matter, what happens when I do a thing, what happens when Boyd does a thing. But when we come together and we're trying to build something, basically what I say is, all right, here's the most batshitly awesome thing I can think of. Science it for me, motherfucker.
And I proceed to give him some vague pseudoscience that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what we did was we determined that they would probably be from a universe that's really, really high in from a planet that's very high in phosphorus. So that when interacting with air that other people breathe, they essentially burst into flame. They would need to have incredibly, fast metabolisms to allow for a regenerative process.
We decided they were from water, like they're an amphibious race, but
right.
That water is like super entrenched with like phosphorus and shit like that.
Right.
A specific strain of it that burns very colorful.
Yeah, that way they could be pretty colors.
Yeah.
And they would the thing that's actually burning is their skin, because it's the skin that has all the phosphorus entrenched in it. And when they grow new skin fast enough, they're just sort of always sloughing off. It's burning. Because
their skin is essentially a waste product.
Yeah, it's like a chitin sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which allowed us to then, and this is the interesting part, you decide that, you figure out how it happens, and then you figure out the implications thereof. Like, we built their society around the fact that people who were lazy, like tiny stuff, like lazy people wouldn't get fat, they would get stiff, because their chitin would like build up and wouldn't be rubbed off by movement and work, so they would get all like lock jointed. So calling someone, stiff joint would be a way of calling them a lazy shitlord.
And that's kind of where I was heading with the deities thing in fantasy settings. You can say, okay, this race is, very warlike and they like battle and honor. But if you take a look at their pantheon and the gods they revere, and even the smaller gods that have slighter influences to it, you kind of understand the method to their madness, why they war, why it's important to them. And I think, honestly, those are really, science would be the god of the sci-fi setting.
Yeah, pretty much.
So, it's perfect that that's sort of the launching off point. Now, another thing, if you're okay with us moving on.
I don't care, dude.
That I like to establish as much as I can before we start playing, because sometimes I have like a week's warning, is culture. And I will crib from existing cultures, but I try to be esoteric when I can.
I crib much more liberally and obviously.
But yours works so very well. Like, I think if I did it, I would suck at it.
It's essentially, the reason I can crib very well is because when you crib from a culture, the important thing is to understand the underpinnings of that culture.
Right.
For instance, if you crib from, let's say, ancient Mesopotamia, and you understand the underpinnings of why they did what they did, what their religion was, why this religion sprang up, what were their challenges in life, then you crib from that culture. If you crib the surface elements from that culture, it's important to bring with it some of the underpinnings, because those underpinnings are the reason that culture exists in the first place. So if you put the underpinnings in place, it feels much more natural.
That's something that you advised me on very early in our friendship. I believe I wanted to make a race of people that were Vikings, or rather I wanted to give Viking gods to a race of people, but not have them be Vikings, and you were like, that wouldn't make any fucking sense, because that's why Vikings were Vikings.
Or, to come at it from an atheist perspective, as it were, that's why Vikings thought up and decided to worship those gods. Because their culture revered these things, so the gods that sprang up in their tales and legends were gods that reflected those ideals.
Sure, yeah. Vice versa. Basically.
Whichever way it ended up happening, what they revere, be it religious, be it logical, be it simple, like moral, what a culture reveres, it really, really helps you understand what it values, obviously.
Yeah, that's a really simple way to put that. And I'm going through a lot of interesting nuance in my strongest sci-fi setting right now, which is called Starhammer. Books hopefully forthcoming. Don't hold your breath. I mean, they will eventually, but because I'm dealing with a lot of races that I initially conceived in a fantasy setting, basically, thousands of years later, uplifted, you can space now. So these are races I conceived of that had, active deities, that had magic. And these are things that they don't really have anymore. Why did they go by the wayside? What were they replaced with? What of their culture still remains? These are fun sort of questions I still get to ask myself. And I think it shows in a lot of ways the differences between the characters. I'll leave names of the players out to be, maintain anonymity. But there is one character who comes from a culture that is very similar to Chinese, classic Chinese religion. But it fell by the wayside long, long ago, way before space travel. So, at this point, they're Easter Sunday Christians, if you will, in regards to their older religion. They have other shit to be doing. The modern world is,
the modern world,
less fantastic than that. There is another character, however, who comes from a planet, or a section of a planet where space travel is not a huge thing. like out in the boondocks, basically. So there's still a lot of room for that, okay, so there's not so much magic anymore, but we still do revere the gods. They're very important to us. We follow the old traditional ways. Contrast with the Space Viking, who is, who, blood for the blood god, and why not?
Who is looking to gather himself a seat high at Odin's table, as it were. Space Odin.
Space Odin, yeah.
Odin with a space helmet on. Not one of those normal modern ones from the spacesuits. Think like really, really old school fucking Z-Rust ass Flash Gordon space helmet. Right on Odin's flappy hat.
A flappy hat on top of it.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, eye patch on the helmet.
Yeah, I mean seriously, that's the only way to
go. So I've come up with a lot of settings in my time. I could probably talk for a long time on a lot of that shit.
Who gonna stop you, eh?
Well, I'd like to. I don't want this to just be a me podcast. Otherwise, I would have made it a different video. But I find, especially as of this conversation, the way you go about getting a setting off the ground and the reasons you make the choices you make to be very intriguing. Let's go into something else that we sort of mentioned in borrowing from other cultures. Something both you and I do is borrowing from established franchises.
Borrowing other people's intellectual property.
Yeah. I mean, it's a role-playing game. It's never going to go anywhere.
I'm not going to make money off this. So.
Yeah. So, everybody does it, whether it's something as simple as, you guys run into Conan the Barbarian in the Wastes, or something a little more subtle where you've borrowed the capital city from some sci-fi book you read when you were 9.
Done that.
Please. But I think you, at least in my perceptions, tend to pull off your rip-offs with aplomb.
Yeah, they just say inspiration is knowing how to hide your sources. I say inspiration is knowing how to actively not hide your source, but do it in a classy way.
Well, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. What is a classy way? The setting we've been talking about, your fantasy setting, most thickly. Come on, fucking.
All right, I can help you.
Yeah, please, yes. Just
okay.
You thought I wanted you to go first because I was eating ramen. I'm just dumb.
In building the setting, I took liberally from a lot of different fantasy settings, actually. Some he's not aware of, some that I can't tell you, because him being aware of them would make spoilers happen, as if from nowhere. For people who understand these, for people who know the things, please note that I'm aware some of these books aren't good. But, and this has always been my idea, this has always been the way I hold the things cleave to setting and fantasy and stuff, I never let a terrible author get in the way of a good idea. And so there are a lot of books that I'm not actually super fond of that I stole ideas from. And he's never read these books, so they're safe. Because he's not gonna, let's be honest.
I can't read.
There's a book, The Way of Shadows. It's a fantasy novel. There's a couple other books in the series. I've read them all up to a certain point. I stole a bunch of shit from that, but he doesn't see it because he hasn't seen the thing. I stole a bunch of stuff from the Wizard's First Rule, the Sword of Truth series. Just a whole bunch of shit. Again, never let a bad author get in the way of a good idea. But again, he doesn't see it because a lot of it's in the magic, and he's not involved in the magic because none of that shit is anywhere near him.
We have a barbarian pirate king and an assassin.
Also, I actually did a lot of original work on the magic because I'm a wizard at heart. Magic settings are kind of my thing, and they help inform your fantasy. But I'll get back to that.
I would like to as well.
The thing that I cribbed from, not even the most, but the thing I took a lot of the surface elements from, is the Song of Ice and Fire. More so than the Game of Thrones TV series, A Song of Ice and Fire, the books.
Because the TV series wasn't quite out yet.
Well, it wasn't quite out yet, and because even when it was, they made some changes that I like, but for the purposes of my game, not useful. But as for instance, I think you've mentioned this on the podcast before, I stole the name the House of Blue Leaves for a bunch of sorcerers in a very prosperous city surrounded by desert, a la Karth. They're very, very different, but I stole the accoutrement, and I stole the general aesthetic, whilst at the same time making them a different set of people. Now, the reason I was able to make that come across well is because I didn't make A Song of Ice and Fire, so I only have my theories as to the underpinnings, why they are the way they are. As if, for instance, the House of Blue Leaves in the book series is very ostentatious. They're very much, even the visions Daenerys has in there are very couched in metaphor and that sort of thing. That's because in that universe, in Westeros and Essos, magic is angry and dangerous and very, very minimally helpful. As the saying goes in the setting, magic is a sword without a hilt. There is no safe way to wield it. And it's really a very good line. Yeah. That makes underpinnings. Magic has been going away for a long time, so they built themselves up the trappings of wizardry because they were losing the actual thing and they needed to maintain their respectability. And in this universe, the difference that makes it very important is that magic hasn't gone anywhere. It's just always been under the radar. So while I have the accoutrement, it's much more subtle. Because they feel, as they have power, there's no need to be ostentatious about it. That small change allows me to keep the sort of ethical spirit of that thing, while at the same time changing it enough that it's not a straight rip-off. I do similar things with with Bravos. I basically stole the whole fucking city. I changed its name to Cilicia. It's a translation of some other word. I'd have to look up in my notes to tell you what at this point, because that's its thing. That's the name of the city. The Titan is there. He's there for the same reason. He's essentially a big-ass chain across the bay that acts as a way of blocking sea invaders. It's Venice. Let's be fair. George R. R. Martin stole Venice for Bravos in the first place.
I built a houseboat.
And I flip some stuff on its head. That's one of the great ways to do sort of something inspired by an homage, if you will, to use a polite term, is taking a thing, figuring out why it's that thing, if you can, and then seeing if you can change it around. For instance, in Bravos, only rich people wear black. And lower tier people wear a very bright, shiny color. There can be a lot of reasons for that, but, I mean, probably it's just that it's really hard to get black dye. In the reverse, I changed it around. The rich people wear very bright colors, and more lower class people wear a lot of black, wear a lot of darker colors. How does that change the ideals? How does that change who they are? And it's also, that's more in keeping with standard sort of fare in real life. And that's the sort of thing I do, is to give you an idea. I take what I want from a given thing that I'm trying to use as inspiration, and I change what's necessary to make it different, give it enough different flavors that I can work with it, whilst at the same time keeping the general aesthetic.
I work under harder constraints because once I started, like, actively, being inspired by stuff, I wanted to take a lot of those elements and make them my own for the purpose of eventually making money off of it. So I wanted to, again, be inspired by it, but distance myself as much as possible from the original idea, because I don't want to be a rip-off artist. I mean, it was one thing back when I did D&D games, and sometimes in the cult books you'll notice, where someone will say a witty one-liner from another character, from something else, or...
To be fair, in the Cult Recon books, usually that's that character actually actively making a reference.
Oh, yeah. Well, but, I've done it in games before. There was a game where your monk sensei was just Chuck Norris.
Yep. Just Chuck Norris.
Like, yeah, I did that.
Specifically Walker, Texas Ranger.
I did that shit before, but it wasn't until very, very recently that I started, what's the word I'm looking for?
Using, instead of taking a thing and sort of sanding off the serial numbers and changing things so as it's your thing now, you're instead using all the parts that thing gave you, all the different little pieces as like a toolbox to create new things.
Yeah, I would say I am manufacturing inspiration.
Right.
Because there is a lot of work into it, more than when I read the Anita Blake series and went, I need to write a book about something kind of similar because I can do this better. This is more me going, I love a lot of what's going on here, but I'm not a dick.
Which is pretty similar to what I would do if I felt like doing a thing that required that I make money. Sure.
But this is a new venture for me largely, so a lot of that input is useful not only in role playing games, but in the other projects I've got going on. Now there was something you said toward the beginning that reminded me of something else. Just because a book is a bad book doesn't mean it didn't have good ideas. I am reminded of something that was said about e-fetting to you. And I think that's an interesting correlation, and I wonder how much in the past it's inspired me to do the same thing. You or me or somebody, I'm probably going to get all the details wrong, so I'll just...
Yeah.
One friend said to another, just because the wrestling that's on TV right now is shitty doesn't mean we can't show them how to make that same story good.
Oh, yeah, no, I actually do remember the details of that. The exact phrase was, so what? So what? Do it better.
Yeah,
exactly. Let's show them how it's done. Just do it better.
Right. And that sort of mindset's really cool and really clever because a lot of times, I do find that, this is a good idea, but this is a shitty final product.
Like, a great example, probably the best example I can think of. And I'm going to have to preface this because just the fact that I've read these novels is somewhat controversial. I've read quite a few, like 6 of the Gore novels. They were available for free at my workplace, and I had a lot of time in between the work I had to do at my day job. And they were the only thing available for entertainment, because my day job has strict technology rules, and I didn't get to have my cell phone.
He's a wizard, a techno wizard.
Anyway, there's just a lot of security around my day job.
No, yeah,
okay?
Yeah. I work at National Major Retail Chain. It's cool.
So these books were available. Now, let me stay right out front. They're fucking awful. They're just the most rank bullshit. And we endeavor not to get political on the Two Nerds podcast, but I feel I must say this because 1, it's true, and 2, you kind of have to address this anytime you talk about these novels. They're incredibly fucking sexist. Just wow. That said, the ideas separate from those very, not going to use that term, so those very troublesome elements.
Hold on, let me finish my Dr. Habert laugh. Okay, good.
Aside those troublesome elements, there are really good ideas there that I'd love to use, that I'd love to strip the terrible parts off of, and use those good ideas that were at the base of this setting, of this universe, that got mired down in the author's, 1, lack of technical skill, and 2, just severe emotional issues.
Like, it's kind of an archaeology, isn't it? Just like, oh, look here, a wonderful dinosaur bone surrounded by a bunch of stupid, shitty rocks.
Let's just gently... It's like watching Deep Space Nine because Odo's in it.
Yeah. Oh, man. Someday I'm going to sit down and try to watch Deep Space Nine again and be like, oh my god, this is amazing. What the fuck was I watching when I was a kid?
From what I understand, it is if Star Trek was Battlestar Galactica instead of being Star Trek.
Oh, wow. This is a different podcast. That's interesting. And the archaeology and the, fuck it, let's do it better mentality. I like that. I'd like to see more people talking about that. Usually we just do podcasts to staple our opinions out there on the internet, and sometimes we'll ask you guys for your input and stuff, but I hope even away from this podcast, there are people who are talking about, like, what's the best way to tell a story. Now, this is something I've done a lot of. What's the best way to tell a story without using the exact fucking scaffolding around that story?
How does one insert new tropes into an already well-worn formula?
Or, what's the best way to file off those serial numbers when not everything is controllable? The way I've done when I've run various video game plots past you guys. I would love to see other people talking about this exact kind of shit we're discussing, because I think it's such a rife territory for ideas. And
it's the kind of thing you see people talk about when they talk about redoing classics. Like, how do you make A Midsummer Night's Dream again and make it fresh?
Sure.
How do you make The Taming of the Shrew again and make it fresh?
I would like to see that in the context of role-playing. Even behind the scenes, like, how do we remake the Temple of Elemental Evil and keep it fresh? I would love to know what the ideas bouncing around there are. But, so there was one more thing I want to get to, because we are waning a bit. This conversation went by pretty quick, actually. You mentioned magic earlier and how it's intrinsic to the setting. Now, I have a hard time coming up with the magic. Like, honestly, when I make a fantasy setting, I will get the races down, I'll get the geography down, I will get, like, fucking merchant trade routes down, I'll get the government set up, the cultural influences, and then I hit magic and I go, oh fucking no, and abandon it.
Whereas for me, because of how I cut my teeth as a role player and because of the kind of person I am, one of the reasons I start with the creation engine of things is because that really informs what the magic rules are. And the listener, you might be aware I'm a pretty big fan of Harry Potter.
They might not be, honestly.
They might not be, but I am. Here's the thing. The magic system in that book series is bullshit. Such bullshit. The most important part of a magic system in any setting, book, television, movies, I don't care. It needs to follow rules. Doesn't matter what the rules are. It needs to follow rules. Magic A is magic A. Magic B is magic B. The rules for how you do the magic, even if the person who's watching or absorbing the content doesn't get them, isn't handed them, they need to follow a set of rules. Because magic is, so far as most people are aware, myself included, not a thing we have access to that exists in our current reality here on Earth.
If you know otherwise, listener,
fucking tell me.
Just leave us a link in the comment sections. Maybe don't yell at them so much. You're going to scare them off. Ultimo Dragon.
I'm very serious about this.
Ultimo
okay?
Dragon, just PM me, okay? I won't let him yell at you.
Anyway.
For the record, you're not talking about the, what is it, Gamp's laws?
Yeah, Gamp's laws of elemental transfiguration. No, it needs to follow, like, if one were to have all the rules of magic in a given setting, one should be able to extrapolate any possible spell, any possible magical interaction. Because magic's not a thing that exists, you need to be firm in your creation of it, because that way because physics has rules. So if someone's like, can I throw this here? At the very least, you can figure it out through science, math. You can figure out whether or not it works. That's why magic has to have rules, because you have to be able to figure out whether or not a thing works. Even something so simple as, and this comes from fan fiction, one fan fiction described Harry Potter magic thusly. And this is something that I'm fairly certain isn't in the books, like is not part of the canon as it were, but it's a great explanation and helps make sense of the Harry Potter magic. For them, for that setting, magic is like fairy tales. The specific words of a spell don't matter. The specific situation you're going for, the ingredients in a potion don't matter. The connotation of those things matters. It's about, for instance, why do you use lacewing flies in a potion? Because they create a certain connotation. Lacewigs do this thing, and so that makes a connotation. It makes a link to that sort of behavior.
A lot like the way Harry Dresden does his potions.
Right. Spells work because they apply a certain connotation to things.
Sure.
And that's a way of looking at it. It doesn't really fit because, again, Harry Potter's magic system is broken and bullshit.
Like there are obvious
contradictions.
For example, how would that work with Sectum Sempra? It just plain wouldn't. Harry whipped that out. He didn't know what the fuck it did, and it still did the exact same thing it did for Snape.
Yeah. Magic is bullshit in that setting, and I still love it anyway, but it is. That's really the very opposite of what I go for when I build a magic set, and that's why I try and work it in right at the beginning, because how a world is created in a fantasy setting helps inform how the magic works, why it doesn't work in certain situations, what its limits are, why it has limits. If it doesn't have limits, why doesn't it? How does the world not flinder into a million little pieces?
Well, I think that's interesting because, one could argue, the same way I mentioned that the Force could be considered a deity, that there is magic in the Colt Regan setting. And this is a setting I've mapped out extensively. And there are basically two kinds of quote-unquote magic. One is power coming from another greater being that is either gifted to you as a potential at birth or is something that is directly drawn from a greater being. Or it's phlebotomy. That's a trope. I'm not talking about blood studies. The reason, for example, I feel it's safe to mention this, in Cult, a necrokinetic, or necromancer if you prefer, can raise a corpse from the ground. They have the power to manipulate dead flesh. When you first start raising a corpse, through this exclusive power to manipulate dead flesh, the way they do it, and the reason it takes for fucking ever in the rules, is because they basically take every little tiny piece of the corpse and move it above the grave.
And then reassemble it.
There's a little bit of fluff in the Cult universe that it's in the role-playing book, it's not in the published books. Most necrokinetics, when they raise a zombie, looks a little bit like them. Just because when you draw something, it's going to look a little bit like you.
Unless you have made very concerted effort to get around that internal thing. It's what your brain does. It makes patterns out of itself.
Right. Thank you for lending good words to my shit ones. To a different extent, pyrokinetics in Cult. When you've got a class, a race, if you will, a magicker who is throwing fire, one has to ask, okay, but shouldn't all that heat be causing collateral damage?
Convection.
Yeah.
The age-old problem of pyromancers, pyrokinetics, and wizards who use fire spells everywhere throughout all of fiction. Where's the convection?
The reason there isn't convection is because this quote-unquote magic is sort of like a reflex. It works the way it does because that's how you think it works.
Because that's how you would logically assume it works.
It's...
Because that's how you would naturally assume it works, rather.
Yeah. It's kind of like in the same way how when you go to reach for a cup, you gently lift up the cup. And most people, even after their child stage, don't go to reach for a cup and punch it across the fucking room.
It's the same reason Superman doesn't crush Lois Lane's head every time he, caresses her cheek. It's... Your brain sort of naturally augments and understands what it's going for here.
Right. You don't think about it, though. You're not sitting there going, okay, careful. We just want to pick up the cup. We just want to... Fantastic.
He did a little visual joke of picking up the cup. You're not a Skyrim character.
Yeah, it's not Skyrim telekinesis. And much is the same way with pyrokinetic or necrokinetic or any sort of that sort of reflex magic. It works that way because you think it should.
So, this is something that I brought up with him. If there was an incredibly well-trained, volcanologist who happened to also be a pyrokinetic, they would probably, do a lot with, making a small flame and then melting the entire room around them because they understand convection, so the power would work that way for them.
Fortunately, for balance reasons, it also requires a lot more...
investment.
Yeah.
Because it is a lot larger of a...
energy expenditure. And, for example, punching through a cup is a lot harder than punching it across the room.
You might know it, in here in your brain, but getting it through into the real world requires a lot more concentration because it's fighting against all your brain's natural instincts, and it's just a lot more potential energy you're using.
But to honestly bring us full circle, delightfully, the other half of the magic in Cole, is basically intelligent design. And I can do it that way because, but for a couple of questions that remain lingering, I know exactly where this magic is coming from and why it was given. I know the creation, if not of the universe, of these races. Who made them, why they made them, what gifts they gave them.
And for why.
And the limitations thereof.
And that is why I do that with almost every fantasy setting, because it allows me to set that shit up for basically everything.
What I want to accomplish with magic in a fantasy setting, and I have yet to, I'm tired. Much in the same way I'm tired of humans, dwarves, elves. I am tired of fire, ice, lightning. I am less tired, but still weary of fire, water, earth, wind. It's harder to work with, first of all. Like, earth and wind, you can do some cool stuff. You can. Or not earth and wind, excuse me. Water and wind. You can do some cool stuff. Definitely. But it's harder to work with from a base.
He's not... he's watched Avatar. He has no excuse for these opinions.
No. Well, there's also... I don't want to get into stat crunch at the moment. It's hard to make these abilities both useful, interesting, and balanced.
Yeah, that part's hard.
And distinct from one another.
See, that's where I'm delightfully spoiled, is that I usually create settings in the broad terminology. I create settings, lore, races, those sorts of things. The stat crunch, oh boy, not my area of expertise. I usually farm that out to Squawk.
Here I have made a thing, make it be good. But I don't necessarily, I mean, I will sometimes, but I don't necessarily just want to do the Fire Fira Firaga thing, where, it's the same, but it's gooder. Nor at the same time do I have the sort of time on my hands to make a, 3rd edition spell list.
Which is basically what you kind of have to do if you want to...
Yeah. I mean, it's along the lines of making...
Or you have to be... you essentially have to give a wizard a license that says, here, What do? You tell me.
Yeah, well,
Tell me, roll your shit. We'll see if it works.
What I want to do is experiment with other magic elements, if you will, oeuvres, styles. I would love to see, like, magic that's based on, bugs, for example. I would love to see magic that is... I had a bunch of these written down, and now I can't think so much of it. But let's say gravity. You know, there's a lot of ideas I'd like to toy with, and, like, that's the magic everybody uses kind of thing. But there is a question back at the beginning, and that is why? Because you know what? Johnny on the fucking corner, Von Wizardson, is not going to go, alright, I am making wizard spells. I have figured out how to get me food easier and light consistently.
Which is really your base.
As a wizard, that's what you want. And then you can make other magics. They don't go, how do I make bugs pour out of someone's eyes? They go, should probably, make for fire. I should probably call the lightning of the heavens.
See, fire, I think, is one you can't really get around. Fire is a primal human desire. It's something that's been ingrained in us for so long that our brains don't really know how to around it. So unless all magic was practiced by non-human races, any wizard's going to always try and make fire first. Fire you can't necessarily get around. The other's much more mutable, because you simply need to craft a setting around which those things are not as useful as gravity manipulation.
But it's something that's going to require a lot of effort, and I have been pursuing other ventures lately. But those are my stated goals. Boy, before you take us out in a timely fashion this time, is there anything you'd like to do with a campaign that you haven't had the ability to do yet? Any world you'd like to create that you think you have the potential for inside you, but you just haven't been able to release?
It's more so a question of worlds I feel, whether or not I feel I can make it interesting enough to catch my players' attention.
That's
because fair. My players are somewhat piggy.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I think you do. And so it's about making a world...
The listener's just like, dude just said he hates humans, elves, dwarves, and regular magic. Of course he's fucking picky.
So it's about making a setting that has hooks that interest them. I can make settings, like, all day, every day. It's something I do in my brain, literally, for fun as a pastime. That's not even a joke. But it's about making something that interests my players.
Which is wise.
So, I don't know. I can't possibly know until I have it presented in front of me. There are genres of game I'd love to do, but that's not a setting problem. It's a genre problem. Those aren't the same.
That's true. We covered some interesting ground today. I think it's a very interesting conversation. I hope you guys found it as, as thought-provoking as I did, because it's good talk, man. Good talk.
Well, you know what, I was going to say something about catch you next time, but whatever. Everything's better when nerds talk about it.
Thank you.
Fuck it, let's get hardcore! Blood, pain, we're all insane. Suffer head trauma, destroy our brains. High dives, guns